In the rush of the modern world, it's easy to forget the power of a simple gesture. But what if one small action could change the fate of many lives? This is the story of Leah, a 6-year-old girl who proved that kindness knows no bounds. Leah lived with her mother, Sarah, in a small house where love was always bigger than the challenges they faced. Even in the simplicity of their life, Sarah taught Leah the value of helping others. But neither of them could have imagined that an ordinary afternoon in the park would transform not just their lives, but also the life of a stranger Leah met that day. A man who had lost everything, even his own identity. John wandered the streets with no memory, not knowing who he was or where he came from. But what seemed like just another day of pain and loneliness was about to change. All because of a sandwich offered by a child with a pure heart. Get ready for a story of unexpected reunions, unwavering kindness, and a heartwarming ending. Because sometimes, the smallest gestures can have the biggest impact. It was a peaceful Saturday at the park. The blue sky stretched above, and the sound of children's laughter echoed in the air. Leah and Sarah sat on a simple blanket, enjoying the moment. For Sarah, it was a rare break from the hard work routine, and for Leah, it was a small adventure in her innocent world full of discoveries. Leah, with her big curious eyes, always noticed things others didn't. And that day, she saw something different. In the distance, sitting alone on a wooden bench, was a man who seemed oblivious to the movement around him. His name was John, though no one there knew. To the others, he was just another invisible figure, lost in the shadows of the city. John had been sitting there for hours. With torn clothes, messy hair, and a blank stare, he didn't seem to expect anything, and no one expected anything from him. He had lost everything, including himself. His mind was wrapped in a fog, a constant confusion that kept him from remembering who he was, where he came from, and why his life had taken this turn. Leah didn't understand where John's troubles came from, but she didn't need to. The kindness in her heart was greater than any explanation. And with the simplicity of a child, she looked up at her mother and asked, "Mommy, can I give my other sandwich to that man?" Sarah looked at Leah, surprised, but then smiled and nodded. Sarah knew they couldn't really afford to give away food, but she also knew how important it was to teach her daughter about generosity. "Of course, sweetheart. Go ahead and give it to him," she said, watching proudly as Leah stood up and walked toward the man. Little Leah, with her pure heart and innocent smile, approached John with light steps. At first, he didn't even notice her, lost in his own thoughts, until a soft voice broke the silence. "Sir, would you like my sandwich?" John looked at her, confused. It was such a simple gesture, but so uncommon. He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to accept. But then, something inside him broke, a barrier he didn't even know was there. With trembling hands, he took the sandwich, and with a lump in his throat, he simply said, "Thank you." There were no words to fully express what it meant to him. Leah smiled and ran back to her mother, while John, with eyes full of tears, took a bite of the sandwich. For Leah, it was just a sandwich. For John, it was more than food. It was a reminder that even when the world seems to have forgotten you, there's always someone who can still see you. In that small gesture, John found a thread of hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. John watched as Leah ran back to Sarah, who embraced her with pride. And in that park, amidst the simplicity of an ordinary afternoon, a 6-year-old girl did something extraordinary. Without knowing it, Leah had planted the seed of change that would soon transform lives, including her own. What seemed like just another day at the park was about to become the beginning of an unexpected journey. A journey no one could have predicted. As John held the sandwich, something began to stir inside him. It was as if, for a brief moment, the world stopped being a blur. He felt the warmth of the bread in his hands, the salty taste of the ham and cheese. But along with it came a distant memory, a life he could no longer reach. There was a time when John wasn't this lost man on the streets. He was John Miller, a successful man, the director of a company, with a family who loved him. Life seemed perfect, until the day everything changed. It was on a rainy night when John's fate took a cruel turn. A terrible accident, and then nothing. He woke up in a hospital with no idea who he was, no memories, no past. All that remained was the chaos in his mind and the pain of not recognizing himself in the mirror. Without an identity, without memories, he got lost in the vastness of the city. No one knew his name, and he didn't know where he belonged. Wandering the streets, John became a ghost of his former self, invisible to the world he once knew. Months went by, and John, directionless, surrendered to life on the streets. But while he faded into the city, his family fought against despair. They never gave up searching for him, believing that he was still alive, that somewhere John could be found. For John's mother, his wife, and his children, every day was an endless nightmare. The police, the detectives, the searches, it all seemed to lead nowhere. He had disappeared without a trace, and the uncertainty consumed them. How do you move on when the person you love vanishes without leaving a sign? But that day, in the park, something inside John began to shift. The simple gesture of an unknown girl had lit a spark, a flicker of who he used to be. Small fragments of his old life floated to the surface of his mind, and for the first time in months, he asked himself, "Who am I?" John still didn't know who he was, but one thing he knew for sure: something was changing, and this would only be the beginning of his journey back to everything he had lost. But would that spark of hope be enough to bring him back? His family was still waiting for him, unaware that the reunion was closer than they could have imagined. The next morning, the soft light of the sun filled the small house where Leah and Sarah lived. It was an ordinary day, or at least it seemed to be. Leah was playing with her toys on the living room floor, while Sarah prepared breakfast, reflecting on the simplicity and challenges of their everyday life. Everything was peaceful until a loud knock on the door shattered the silence. Sarah turned, her heart racing. Who could it be? They didn't usually get unexpected visitors, and something about the intensity of the knock brought a feeling of apprehension. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the door, hesitating for a moment before opening it. As she did, her eyes widened at the sight of two policemen standing there, serious, right in front of her. Leah, sensing her mother's change in mood, curiously peeked at the uniformed men. "Good morning, ma'am," the first officer said, with a respectful but firm tone. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Anxious thoughts began racing through her mind. What could have happened? Did Leah do something? Or is something wrong with our house? She knew how fragile their life was and how easily things could fall apart. "Good morning," Sarah replied, her voice slightly trembling. "Is there a problem, officers?" The second officer stepped forward, holding his hat in his hands, a gesture of empathy. "We don't want to alarm you, ma'am, but we're here because of something that happened yesterday at the park." Sarah froze. The park? She immediately remembered the man Leah had given her sandwich to. What could that have caused? Could he have? Her thoughts cut off, suffocated by the rising tide of anxiety. "Did something happen?" she asked, trying to hide the panic in her voice. The first officer smiled slightly, trying to reassure her. "Actually, something good happened. We're here to thank your daughter." Sarah blinked, confused. "Thank Leah." Leah, who had now come closer, peeking curiously from behind her mother, smiled at the sound of her name. The officers turned their attention to the little girl, who watched them without fear, with the innocence of someone who had not yet learned the weight of adult worries. "Yes," the officer continued. "Your daughter gave a sandwich to a man in the park yesterday, didn't she?" Sarah nodded, still not fully understanding where this was going. That man, ma'am, the second officer said, pausing dramatically, is John Miller, a businessman who has been missing for months. He was in an accident and lost his memory, and his family has been desperately searching for him. It was your daughter's gesture that led to his identification and his reunion with his family. Sarah stood still, the officer's words echoing in her mind. She looked at Leah, who was still there, calm, unaware of the deep impact her simple act of kindness had had. I don't know what to say, Sarah murmured, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. Relief, surprise, and emotion overwhelmed her all at once. What had seemed like just an ordinary act of generosity had, in some way, changed the life of a man and his family. The officer smiled, seeing how much it meant to her. John's family is incredibly grateful. They'd like to meet you and thank you in person, if you'd allow it. Sarah turned to Leah, who now had a shy smile on her face. For the little girl, it was still hard to grasp the magnitude of what she had done. But for Sarah, it was clear that that day at the park had not only changed John's life, it had changed theirs too. The simple act of sharing a sandwich had opened doors that Sarah could never have imagined. And at that moment, as she looked at her daughter, she knew that a new opportunity was about to enter their lives. The following afternoon, Sarah and Leah's small home was filled with a palpable nervousness. Sarah still couldn't fully believe what was about to happen. John Miller's family, the man Leah had helped without even knowing, was on their way to meet them. Everything felt surreal. Sarah glanced at her daughter, who was distractedly playing on the couch, unaware of the significance of the moment. To Leah, it was still just about the man from the park, someone she had given a sandwich to because he seemed to need it. Suddenly, the sound of a car pulling up in front of the house brought Sarah back to reality. She took a deep breath and walked to the door, her heart racing with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. When she opened the door, she was greeted by a moving scene. John was standing there, alongside his mother, his wife, and other family members. He looked very different from the man who had wandered the streets. Now, dressed in clean clothes and with a serene expression, he seemed to have finally found part of himself again. John's mother, a delicate woman with eyes deeply marked by both pain and relief, stepped forward. She held a small box in her hands, but what stood out the most was the emotion in her eyes. Before any words were spoken, she reached out to Sarah, grasping her hand firmly and affectionately. I have no words to express what you and your daughter have done. The woman's voice faltered a bit, her words heavy with emotion. When I got the call saying my son had been found, I couldn't believe it. It had been months of despair, not knowing where he was or if he was okay. And then, we found out it was the simple gesture of a child that brought him back to us. Sarah, who had been struggling to hold it together, felt the tears begin to well up. She looked at Leah, now standing by her side, holding her small, innocent hand, still not fully grasping the depth of the situation. We didn't do anything special, Sarah said humbly. It was just a sandwich. John's mother smiled tenderly, shaking her head. Sometimes what seems small to us is everything to someone else. What your daughter did wasn't just an act of kindness, it was the beginning of our hope. And for that, we will be forever grateful. John, who had remained quiet until that moment, stepped forward. His eyes met Leah's, and he crouched down to her level. With a voice hoarse and filled with emotion, he said, "Thank you, little one. I don't remember much from that day, but I remember you. And the sandwich. And, well, I think it was the first step in helping me remember who I am. You did more for me than you could ever know." Leah smiled shyly, still not fully understanding what she had done, but feeling the sincere gratitude in John's eyes. John's mother then turned back to Sarah, holding the small box closer to her. "We want to give back in some way. I know this may seem strange, but my family wants to help you. This isn't just a reward, it's an expression of our gratitude, our recognition of what you've done. We'd like to offer you an opportunity, a fresh start, and I hope you'll accept it with an open heart." Sarah was silent for a moment. Accepting help had never been easy for her. She had always fought to maintain her independence, to support her daughter through her own efforts. But looking into the eyes of this woman, seeing the sincerity and depth of gratitude in her offer, Sarah knew this wasn't charity or a simple handout. It was an opportunity for change, a chance for something that could transform not just their lives, but Leah's future. "I don't know what to say," Sarah murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "We don't do things expecting anything in return, but I'm grateful for your generosity. I accept." John's mother smiled with tears in her eyes as she handed Sarah the box. Inside were documents and a letter explaining the financial assistance and other opportunities the Miller family wanted to provide. "This is just the beginning," John's mother said softly. "We want to be a part of your lives, just as you've become a part of our recovery story." With her heart light and her words filled with gratitude, Sarah embraced the woman standing before her. And in that moment, a new journey began, not only for John, but also for Sarah and Leah. A simple act of kindness had planted the seeds of a brighter future for all of them. As the days passed, Sarah and Leah's lives began to change in ways they never could have imagined. The opportunities offered by John's family opened doors that once seemed out of reach. But for Leah, the world still revolved around simple things: her toys, her friends, and of course, the moments spent with her mother. Sarah, on the other hand, spent a lot of time reflecting on everything that had happened. She knew that her daughter's gesture had been an example of genuine compassion, something rare and precious. On a quiet afternoon, while the two were sitting in the park where it all began, Sarah decided to share an important lesson with her daughter. "Leah, do you know how much that sandwich changed our lives?" Sarah asked, gently stroking her daughter's hair as they sat together on the bench. Leah frowned, thinking hard, then shrugged. "I just wanted to make sure he had something to eat, Mommy." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "And that's exactly what made all the difference. You saw someone who needed help and did what you could. Sometimes, we think we can only help when we have a lot to give. But the truth is, even the smallest gesture can change someone's life." Leah nodded slowly, absorbing her mother's words, though she was still too young to fully grasp the depth of what Sarah was saying. "You know, Leah, real wealth isn't in money, fancy clothes, or big houses. Real wealth is in sharing what we have and helping others when we can. You did that without thinking twice, and look how things have changed," Sarah said, her voice gentle but full of wisdom. Leah smiled, beginning to understand a little more about what her mother was trying to teach her. "So, being rich is helping others?" "Yes," Sarah replied, squeezing her daughter's hand softly. "Being rich is having a heart full of kindness and always remembering that even the smallest act of generosity can make a huge difference." As the two walked home, hand in hand, Sarah felt a sense of peace. What had started as a simple act of her daughter's kindness had turned into something much bigger, not just for John and his family, but for their own lives as well. Leah, with her innocent compassion, had planted a seed of kindness that would continue to grow for years to come. And so, the lasting lesson was left behind. Small acts of kindness can create waves of change that no one expects. They can cross barriers, bring lives together, and bring hope where there was once only darkness. In the end, what truly matters are not the grand gestures, but the small kindnesses, those that come from a generous heart and, as in Leah's case, have the power to transform the world around them. The impact of that sandwich would be remembered by everyone, not as a simple meal, but as a symbol that, no matter how small they seem, acts of compassion have the power to change lives, and perhaps even destiny itself.